Today's episode is brought to you by Scientist.com, the life science industry's leading R&D orchestration platform. Scientist.com gives researchers instant access to thousands of pre-vetted suppliers, saving time, reducing costs, and accelerating innovation.
Hi, I'm John Gagliano, Senior Director of BioPharm Catalyst.
Hello, I'm Chef, known as Chef Station, a 20-year vet in trading biotech stocks.
And this is Biotech Bulls and Breakthroughs. BioPharm Catalyst is not a registered investment advisory firm, and the views on this podcast are not intended to be financial advice. Guests on this podcast may hold the stocks discussed in personal or other investment accounts. This content is for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice. Always do your own research before making any investment decisions. If you find the information on this podcast useful and would like more Catalyst information, BioPharm Catalyst is your premier resource for Catalyst data for over 1,000 publicly traded biotech companies. We track clinical trial-based catalysts, everything from IND filings to drug data releases for phase 1, 2, and 3 trials to regulatory decisions. Our Catalyst calendars are updated as soon as the press release comes out, so you can be sure you have the most timely and accurate information to inform your biotech trading. All of our plans come with a 7-day free trial, and we frequently run discounts on our platform. So check out www.biopharmcatalyst.com to get started today. Good morning, good evening, I should say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to another episode of Biotech Bulls and Breakthroughs. For today's episode, we have a very unique guest on the line. We have Eric Duhaime from Diagonal Therapeutics, actually a privately held biotech company specializing in genetic diseases. And Eric is the Senior Vice President of Finance and Corporate Development. So Eric, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome aboard. And I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Sure, thanks. I appreciate you having me on. Again, Eric Duhaime, Senior Vice President of Finance and Corporate Development at Diagonal Therapeutics. I effectively oversee all of general and administrative functions at Diagonal. I've been with the company for about 3 years. Prior to joining Diagonal, I was the Vice President of Corporate Development and Finance at Goldfinch Bio, another privately held company. Most of my experience over about 20 years of the biopharma industry has been in finance, corporate development, strategic marketing across a number of different small biotech companies. But most of the experience has been focused on rare genetic diseases and helping companies build markets for diseases where there's no really poorly tolerated treatments for patients with really severe diseases.
Very cool. It's certainly a space that we are familiar with ourselves. As you may or may not know, BioPharm Catalyst, we have a ton of investors on our platform who are screening various biotech companies, and rare diseases is definitely an area that we talk about quite frequently. It's an area that gets quite a bit of attention from investors for obvious reasons. So that's really great. You're right at home here. I guess just, if you wouldn't mind just telling me a little bit about Diagonal, just its history, how it got started, and just kind of the general mission when it comes to drug development and attacking rare genetic diseases.
Sure, I'm happy to. So Diagonal started back in 2022 with really an interest in creating clustering antibodies. And effectively clustering antibodies relates to bringing together in a highly specific conformation multiple different receptors at the cell surface to induce normal signaling intracellularly. And so there's a lot of antibody companies that are out there developing inhibitor antibodies to stop signaling from occurring, but not too many companies that were focused on activating antibodies. And so the premise behind the company was really to create novel monoclonal antibodies that did something intracellularly that no one else had been doing previously. And so most of our programs that we work on internally are activators that really require multiple different receptors. And in the case of our lead program, 4 different receptors to come together on a highly specific conformation that will activate the signaling intracellularly. And so what typically happens is, there's a natural ligand that binds to a receptor that induces signaling. But when you have a loss of function or gain of function mutation at the cell surface, that signaling cascade kind of falls apart intracellularly. So the bispecific antibody that we've created takes that complex and forces the association together naturally, or mechanically rather, that will induce normal signaling intracellularly. And you're effectively creating a functional cure for patients with the disease that have a loss of function mutation at the cell surface.
Very interesting. So by that, and with that in mind, how do you pick the we'll say the indications of the diseases that you're targeting?
Yeah, so most of the diseases that we go after are ones where you don't have a standard of care, or the standard of care that is currently used in the clinic is subpar at best. And so most of the work that we're doing is creating markets for diseases where there's really no treatment paradigm, so to speak. And so for our lead program, which is for a rare bleeding disorder called Hereditary Hemorrhagic Telangiectasia, there was really no work that was done. There's a lot of off-label use of old cancer drugs that have an anti-proliferative effect. And it's a disease of loss of function, haploinsufficient, where you have a mutation at one of 2 cell surface receptors, and that causes pretty significant bleeding to the point of chronic anemia for patients. And so, there's about 250,000 patients, both in the US and the EU, and there was no approved therapies. There's still no approved therapies, and very limited amount of work that had been done to really understand what the opportunity was. And so we've done a lot of work internally to really educate both investors, pharma, on what the opportunity for HHT to have a therapy that's actually brought to market could actually mean from a commercial perspective. And so we try to identify opportunities where there's high unmet need, a large patient population, and a clinical path that seems pretty attractable for a small biotech company such as Diagonal to go after on our own, and not require the behemoth to help us shepherd it through late stage development.
Absolutely. And how many assets do you guys have currently in the pipeline?
Yeah, so outside of our lead program that we're developing for hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia, or HHT, we're also exploring it in pulmonary arterial hypertension. And then we have 3 other parallel programs that are more in the lead optimization stage. So our lead is just about to enter the clinic. Diag 723 will be entering the clinic in the first half of 2026. And the other 3 subsequent programs in our clinical pipeline, or in our preclinical pipeline rather, will be getting there probably in the next couple of years, currently in lead optimization right now.
Very cool. Okay, so that's fairly, I would say, fairly robust for a privately held company. And how many folks are at Diagonal? How large is the organization?
So we're 24 full-time employees right now. Most of the folks that we have, they're very experienced individuals that have spent decades of time in biopharma, and specifically biotech. Most of them will wear multiple hats, but we have 24 individuals that are really masters of the craft that they do.
Very cool. I guess one additional question I have is just regarding some of the competitors in the space. As I mentioned, this is obviously an area that is pretty popular right now. Who are some of your main competitors? How do you guys think that you fit within the mold there, right? I know you had mentioned that you guys are a little bit on the smaller side. I don't know if there are larger competitors in the space, and you sort of have, you mentioned that you sort of carved out a niche, but what would you say are are some of the competitive advantages that you have over your competition?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, the way that we approach these diseases is really going after the root cause of the disease. So there are a number of companies that are looking for, anti-angiogenic effects. Anti-angiogenesis will work downstream of the signaling cascade, where the actual problem exists at the cell surface. So there's several nodes down below where the problem actually exists. So the way that we see our clinical differentiation is really to tackle the root cause right at the cell surface where you have the loss of function mutation. And if you can fix that mutated receptor, if you will, you can fix all the downstream pathways and mechanisms downstream. And so if you fix the top, you should be able to fix the bottom as well. Most of the other competitive programs are going to be more likely to fix the bottom of the pathway, whereas we're fixing the top.
I gotcha. Gotcha. Okay, so you guys are really trying to tackle the root cause of the issue.
Right.
essentially.
And every program that we go after tackles it very, very similarly, where there's a mutated receptor and we're bringing together sort of like almost like a molecular glue, if you will, at the cell surface to bring the receptor complex together. And it has to be in a very specific conformation, almost recapitulating what it would be like for a natural ligand to bond
Mhm,
that cluster.
mhm. And what would you say is, some of the, I guess the biggest challenges that you guys face in the current landscape right now in rare genetic disease? Obviously, it's a very complex space. You are talking about, diseases that really don't have anything out there on the market, but what would you say what's the most challenging aspect of what you guys do?
Yeah, I think it's just generating the interest, right? For a disease where there's no approved therapies and there's really not a whole lot in clinical development, it's convincing investors and convincing pharma that this is a disease worth treating and worth
Mhm.
developing a drug for. And so, part of our, part of the effort that we spent over the last 3 years since I joined is really to build that commercial opportunity for folks to see that it's a sizable opportunity.
Yeah.
One of the first things that we did after closing our Series A was to invest heavily in Komodo data. So Komodo is probably the largest claims uh, data provider out there, and they have very pristine data. And most companies of our size and at our stage would not be investing so much in getting data and analyzing the data to show that there's a commercial opportunity or that there's a strong health economic argument. But that was the first thing that we did upon closing the Series A was to generate some data in Komodo, prove that there's a high unmet need, and we published it in the American Journal of Hematology in collaboration with the leading patient advocacy group and the leading KOL in the world. And so once you get a couple of those key thought leaders on the publication coupled with the company, it's been a really great transformation. Now you're starting to see other companies leveraging that work to then go out and get their own capital from investors.
Absolutely. So I mean, based off of that, I mean, you obviously feel like this is an attractive space for investors to be in.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at our syndicate, we have 17 great biotech specific investors who really believe in not only the indication, but believe in the approach. There's a couple other anti-angiogenic companies out there, and they've chosen to invest in us because they believe in the promise of our approach, which we think is really revolutionary, but it actually fixes the underlying cause of disease without having to go into gene therapy. You're using a bispecific monoclonal antibody that are pretty well understood at this point, where if the safety is pretty well known, and using a bispecific antibody to restore normal signaling, you should actually fix the underlying problem that patients have.
Excellent. Yeah, no, that's really great to hear. And certainly, like I said, I mean, it's something that we are, hearing more and more about. I mean, I think, you obviously hear a fair amount about, some of the other key areas, oncology, Alzheimer's. But this space is one that we do talk about quite frequently. And I think that it is one that, you really you really can't ignore, and it certainly does present I think a really good opportunity for investors, and again, just for science in general to be able to advance this. So that's really great. I guess just one kind of final question for you. Obviously biotech is a pretty crazy area to be in. A lot of volatility, a lot of change, always happening. I mean, how do you kind of feel about the general state of things just across the market? Are you optimistic? Are you optimistic about where you guys are at? Just wanted to get your kind of general market thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm highly optimistic where things are heading. We can go on our experience only when we were raising our Series B.
Yeah.
And part of it is the fact that we're going after the root cause in the biology that exists within this particular opportunity. And again, we help to build the awareness, build the momentum of the disease. But we had a lot of interest outside of the 17 investors that have come forward for our investment. There were a lot of other investors that are really interested in HHT, which I think bodes well for, the broader awareness for pharma and investors in the HHT space. But beyond that, it's really, I think the market is starting. You're starting to see more IPOs. You're starting to see more M&A, and I think that bodes well for the future of companies such as ours, who is looking to generate some meaningful data and then see what the next steps would be after that.
Do you have any thoughts on, what sort of the future would look like for Diagonal in terms of, whether you would think about partnerships, with larger companies, or I know you mentioned M&A, or I mean, some of that stuff I know you might not be able to comment on, but I figured I would just, in an ideal world, where you guys are looking ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we recently closed the Series B, so it's we're just enjoying the time to be fully committed to execution.
Yeah.
We have a very productive platform that has built our internal pipeline, and we're open to partnerships to take targets of interest that pharma might have and leverage the capabilities within our platform, or partner some of the assets that we have in our earlier pipeline. But in terms of the future of the company, we're going to continue to keep our options open, continue to have meaningful dialogue with pharma on the merits of our lead program, and then see where the financing opportunities, open up in the future.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Certainly post funding, it's nice to just be able to, just focus on sort of the mission at hand, right?
It's so true. I mean, so much of our team was dedicated to the financing effort that when you finally close it and you can take a step back and a deep breath, now it's fully execution focused and getting our first regulatory filing for our first in-human study that we're anticipating in the first half of this year. And then
that's huge.
Generate clinical data.
Absolutely. That's huge. You guys are right there in terms of that. So that's really great to hear. Well, I really appreciate the time, Eric. I for everyone listening on the line, I think, I know that we have a mixture of listeners and viewers. Some folks are institutional, some folks are retail, some folks are private equity or VC. I know not everyone would necessarily be able to, invest in a company like Diagonal as they are currently private, but it is really important to hear about what's going on within this space, right? And where the space is headed. And who knows, at some point, that could, an IPO could be on the line, or there could be, an acquisition target. So I think it's always good for everyone to be well versed in the players in the space and the ones that are, doing unique things. So I really appreciate the time and you walking us through what you guys are doing.
Of course. Thanks, John. I really appreciate you having me on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And for everyone listening, feel free to like, drop comments, ask any questions, and we will try to get back to you as quickly as we can. But appreciate everyone's time, and thank you guys so much.